East or west? East is best. Or is it? Caught between debt in the east and debt in the west, President William Ruto is back in the east talking about, among other things, more money to extend the railway line from Dukamoja in Narok to Brazzaville in Congo-Brazzaville. That is tall, or in railway terms, long. Tough choices abroad and difficult options at home, where teachers, nurses, civil servants and even airport workers are making demands on the streets. But it is the education sector that is drawing particular concern as turbulence hits universities over the funding model. We walk down the bans and the strikes by divided teachers' unions. Jamila's memo is addressed to the newly constituted cabinet. And that memo is on your desks, in the office, and not on your sunroof. Sam Sense tries to make sense of bribery as a path to promotion, especially in teaching. On Kai Kai's kicker, who will eat the new JKIA airport? It's a greed festival alert. And on my take, just who does Gilbert Masengeli think he is? The news gang is here.
The necessity of having this infrastructure is agreed across the region, and it's not a Kenyan project. It is actually a regional project in line with the Belt and Road Initiative of the Chinese government.
Welcome to the News Gang, ladies and gentlemen. And we begin in the east, not of Kenya, but, in China, which is where the president and a very good portion of the cabinet is. Sam, what are they doing there?
Well, I clearly am not there, but I think it's a conversation because this has been going on for a couple of years now for the presidents of African countries to go to Beijing to have a session with the president. Of course, there has been conversations on how to cooperate on different avenues of development, whether it's about infrastructure or it's about management of public debt. So this time round, it appears like even the stories that we run in the news is just about looking for avenues of how China can be of more support to the African countries, especially those that have been finding themselves in a debt distress situation. And I recall that not long ago, or it might be long, 2018, I was in Beijing to cover the visit of President Uhuru Kenyatta at that time, attending that meeting of FOCAC. And of course, you're there to cover your president as those conversations are going on. But I have to tell you that I only saw him at close range once because he was passing from a meeting. That time, I think it was a meeting with the ruling party of China. We even tried to reach him to get a question, and that was not possible. But the other meetings, then there are the large-scale meetings that you find the president of China sitting in the middle of a table, a very long table. Then there's a whole area that you find the area the president is sitting. And then one of the days you find that, especially towards the end, that you have sort of a photo opportunity for the presidents of Africa. So you find the president of China waiting, greets every other president. And I think one of the images that stuck that time is how the presidents of Africa were queuing behind each other, waiting for the opportunity to go and greet the hand of the president of China. But now, the more important question about the deals that would emerge from such situations or such conversations, I think these are conversations that happen behind the scenes, because I remember at that time we were also trying to get access to the Transport Cabinet Secretary at the time, that is James Macharia, who had been quite involved in several meetings. They were talking about infrastructural support for the expansion of the SGR. Of course, there were not very many successful reports that are coming out of there. But it's a very busy few days. But also, as you have seen, it has also been an opportunity for the President of Kenya to have a moment with the presidents of Africa, a section of them, of course, to speak about the African Union Commission chairmanship, the candidature of Raila Odinga, to sort of try to convince them. Of course, taking advantage of the opportunity that you have the African presidents meeting all of a sudden within the same space. So we've been seeing him trying to get to speak to them as part of the diplomatic efforts to really campaign for the candidature of Raila Odinga. But as far as what will be achieved, I think we'll have to wait until proper communication has been given. And
I think, Yvonne, it's important to look at what has come out of that conversation now, but look at the past and what the role of China has been in Africa. I think China first started its relationship or its association with Africa in the year 2000. And I was looking at some data that says between the year 2000 and 2022, China has lent over $117 billion to 49 African countries. This is for different projects, from military to trade to education to infrastructure to, I think they've contributed to 35 major ports being built across Africa, hydropower projects and all that. And you know, people have been saying that China uses soft power to try and get into Africa, looking at the resources that Africa has. You know, we're always being accused of not being able to add value to what we have, to raw materials, so we may need help from China and all those countries to help us do that. But if you look at the attendance of heads of state, African heads of states in this summit, 53 out of 54 countries were represented, of course, except for Eswatini, because it recognizes Taiwan as an independent state. So because of all that, that's why they were not invited. But 53 out of 54 African countries are represented there. And reports from there tell us that about $50 billion has been given in financing Africa, but not all of it is lending. I was looking at the data. It says about 10 billion of it is foreign direct investment, and this was a key ask by the African countries when they were negotiating for the money they were asking for. But I think, Yvonne, we also need to look at how trade between China and Africa has been over the years, and data shows that about a lot. The top. I'm going to look at the top 6 countries that are trading with China and how much money they've been trading. And this is just data for 2023. According to the UN data, China trade value partners in 2023. South Africa is the biggest at $35.9 billion, because South Africa apparently bought more Chinese goods than any other country in Africa. Number 2, the biggest trade relationship is with Angola. That's $27.3 billion. And then you look at what Angola has in terms of oil and minerals, including diamonds. And then we have Nigeria with a joint trade value of about $23.9 billion. And then DRC is in 4th place with $21.9 billion. And then you go to North Africa and look at Egypt. Egypt is rapidly expanding its infrastructure. Ukienda huko utapata bridges ni nyingi sana zinajengwa. And has more than $18.2 billion worth of joint business with China. And then Kenya is in 5th place with $8.5 billion that they have been trading. But then people would ask, so what happens to the promises that are made? Are they fulfilled at the end of the summits, if you look at previous summits? Because I think the last 2, the amount of funding that was promised was about $60 billion. So you look at how it has been the past 3 years. So whatever that was promised delivered, and then now you look up to the next summit. What are the promises that will be made, and how will they be fulfilled?
And you know what's interesting about it is the fact that you said the relationship between China and Africa started in the year 2000, and the start of this FOCAC and this conference was actually at the urgings of African nations, in the late 1990s. And then China took this away and, made it its own in terms of of course, thinking future, political and economic ties. But also it came interestingly at a time that there had been, I think, the first Europe-Africa summit. And so it's trying to dilute or counteract, if you like, perhaps that's a better term, Europe's influence in Africa. But one of the key things, as Jamila has mentioned, is debt. And, so this is a very interesting relationship, even taking a look at all of the numbers. And particularly for Kenya, too. There's always been the question about, whether we face east or we face west, and what does that mean? What are we getting from the east, and what are we getting from the west? What are the conditions surrounding that? Gunboat diplomacy, maybe?
Well, incidentally, in his speech to the gathered African head of state, the president of China, Xi Jinping, did not talk about debt at all. He did not mention it in his in his speech, which again points to what China has perfected, and that is soft diplomacy. Debt, of course, is a big issue. And China is big in Africa in two ways. China is Africa's biggest trading partner. And China is also Africa's biggest lender. A lot of nations owe China a lot of money. And in these forums, we can never fail to detect that very strategic approach by the Chinese government to further its influence. They know what they hold already in Africa, because like Jamila has listed, China's hand in major infrastructure projects is all over. Whether you're talking about hydropower, whether you're talking about roads, dams, you will always you're always likely to see the hand of the government of China in that. And this strategic relationship has unfortunately not translated to addressing the question of trade imbalance, because the trade, the balance of trade,
it keeps growing wider,
keeps growing
and not in our
wider,
advantage,
in favor of China, which again points to the absence of a clear plan on the African front. I'm just wondering, the 53 of them will be there, and that will mean there'll be 53 different intentions.
But China has
one. China has got it's wide-eyed. It's dealing with Africa as it should, as one region. And a hydropower project in Ghana, a hydropower project in Nigeria, roads and railways in Kenya. And for them, this is one game plan. And you look at Africa, and it was interesting to hear President Ruto talking about the extension of the railway from Kenya to Congo-Brazzaville. And the question would be, has that been discussed with the nations that are along this path? Because if you're talking about extending the railway from Naivasha to Congo-Brazzaville, then you actually, the first people you have to convince, the first country you have to convince is Uganda. They need to buy that in. DRC or in the north, maybe the Central African Republic is the other country that you have to convince, and all the way to Congo-Brazzaville. So is Africa having a concerted approach to these meetings, or are we, like in the biblical times, listening to different tongues, an entire 53 tongues versus one?
And what's interesting, I'd like us to listen to the president when he spoke about that, because when we started off, we heard from him on the extension of SGR. But, let's listen to him also talking about another project for which we have received funding, and that is the Rironi-Mau Summit Highway. Let's listen.
Thank you for the conclusion of the program on Kenya's rural roads, the intelligence transport system that has now been concluded.
So this is what we've gone to China for. So it's the standard gauge railway, the Rironi-Mau Summit, Eldoret-Malaba dual carriageway projects. Those are the top priorities for the engagement in China. But you know what's interesting is, particularly on the extension of the SGR to the border, this was tried again and didn't succeed in 2019, I believe. At the same time, the common denominator apparently in these two trips is Raila Odinga, because at the time in 2019 it was Uhuru Kenyatta and Raila Odinga who went to China, failed to secure what they were looking for at the time, which was $3.6 billion for what is phase 3 of SGR, now to Kisumu and then to the border. Instead, what they got was $400 million to upgrade the meter gauge railway, you know, the one we all know, to the Malaba border. You know, all the time, at that point, there was a point when China was a bit reluctant to continue to fund SGR. You know, they were instead funding other projects in the country. But, you know, this then brings, of course, into focus the issue of debt, but particularly the issue of the viability of the standard gauge railway. That has been a problem. You know, Linus, you were talking about we have to get Uganda's buy-in, and Uganda has been hot and cold on this. At some point, Uganda and Tanzania were working on their own railway, ignoring Kenya, and now we know that the 4 East African countries have actually come together. So it's been blowing hot and cold. But you would understand why, because when you take a look at, for instance, the cost of running SGR and versus the returns that we are getting, plus the loans that we have to pay, then there are some questions to be asked. So there were some documents from the Kenya Railways Corporation, particularly tender documents, where they were looking for a supplier for diesel. And this is what they found. 38 million litres of diesel is required per year to run SGR. And that, well, you know, at the time, if you look at it, I don't know what the cost was, but this was in 2023, it was about 6.2 billion shillings just to power the trains. Now, in total, according to parliamentary records, it costs about 18 billion shillings in total to run SGR. But what do we make? What's the revenue? As of January, September 2023, it was 11.7 billion versus revenue of 11.7 billion versus costs of 18 billion. You can already see this is not a going concern. And remember, this was meant to be, and there's been many attempts to try and ensure, and then sometimes force it to be a lot more profitable. Right? Remember, this was a cargo railway. This, you know, the Madaraka Express was, by the way, this was mainly meant to be cargo. But you'll remember things were so dire that at some point in 2019, the government tried to force all importers of goods to use SGR. And they were saying this is against WTO, this is restrictive policies. WTO clearly says there should be a free flow of cargo by the most cost-effective means. So they were trying to get cargo moving off from the roads and onto SGR in a bid to try and make it more profitable. Of course, this was abandoned at some point. And not only were they trying to force them onto SGR, they then hiked the freight charges. So by road, it was about 85,000 to 90,000 for a 40-foot container, and on SGR, it was 100,000. So, of course, it didn't make sense for the importers of these goods. And then you start to see, you know, other things, you know, trying to make money. There's now a premium railway service at 12,000 shillings for a one-way trip. So a round trip would be 24,000 shillings
per person.
Per person. Mm-hmm. And what are the frills you're getting compared to you could jump onto, you know, a quick airline, budget airline, and pay 12 to 15,000 return. So it's some of the, you know, thinking around SGR and whether it indeed makes money and is a going concern. And by the way, all those 38 million litres of diesel you're using, now it would seem for us to actually make it more viable, we would need to borrow more, to invest more in this project that is already having problems. Why? Because what were we thinking getting a diesel railway? Because now we're thinking the best way to do it is to electrify the trains. Yeah. But we're barely at the Malaba border to begin with. And so this is the paradox for me, I think, with SGR. Even as we continue to seek more money, I don't know if it's putting good money after bad, Sam.
Well, first of all, if you're to look at the arrangement between Kenya and China in terms of the borrowing that we take, it has been largely about financing specific projects. At this point in time, they are talking about public debt of 10.5 trillion shillings, depending on the source that you're relying on. You find that we still owe China. I'm looking at the data of the bilateral loans, that is the loans between Kenya and other countries, and China was leading at 70%. This is data as of April 2023. Of course, the situation could be slightly different now, but largely almost the same. That time, so you had a total bilateral debt of 1.2 trillion shillings. China, we had taken 856 billion shillings from China. But then if you have to look at the debt currency at the time, meaning we took this loan at what currency? The Chinese yuan was only accounting for 5.4%, meaning there's a lot of debt that you're getting from China, but it's coming in the form of US dollar. Again, like I said, the loan from China is coming to finance a particular project. Case in point what you're saying about SGR. If you have to look at what do we do to ensure that we can actually reorganize our debt, because bilateral debts and multilateral debts, meaning debts from global institutions like World Bank and the IMF, they're slightly cheaper.
Yes.
Not slightly, actually. They are almost
concessionary
exactly
in many aspects.
So the interest is way cheaper than the domestic debt. And remember, as we speak right now, the biggest headache for the government of Kenya is the cost of the domestic debt, because the interest is going up to now, I think, about 18% for the bonds. Yet for the bills, you're talking about between 15 and 17%. So that is extremely high, while you can get some bilateral loans or multilateral loans at single-digit interest. So one would have hoped, as a layman, that Kenya can get a loan from China to trade it off with another loan so that you can continue to service this particular one, which is way cheaper. But that will not happen, because as you're getting a loan from China, it's to support, like you're saying, those road projects, the railway project itself. So it doesn't really help the figures of the debt. In any case, it makes them go higher. And of course, meaning that eventually you have to pay that debt, extending the amount of time that you require. So really, even as the president, because I'm looking at some of the articles they're talking about that the aspirations of African countries were to sort of get cheaper loans. That will not happen.
No.
The question of managing the debt portfolio still remains back at home. It will not be resolved anywhere near China or near Beijing, if you may like. So really, we will have to wait and see what more thoughts and innovations that the government and specifically the National Treasury can come up with to really get to the point of resolving some of these questions that will trouble the country for some more time.
And you know what, you talk about commercial versus concessionary debt. So concessionary is not only cheaper, but even there's a lot more wiggle room. It is with World Bank, IMF and the others that you could perhaps even start to speak of writing off a debt. With commercial debt, like we've gotten from China, there is no writing off of that debt. That is not in question. The options that are available there are renegotiation. Like you were saying, okay, so can we extend the repayment period? But paying, you must and you will. And that is what I think is interesting for me with this one, and where the conversations would start to go, because commercial debt being forgiven is a tall order. And
I think, Yvonne, for a lot of Kenyans, when they see this, of course, the African presidents, including William Ruto, going to China, and of course the $50 billion being promised, I don't know what percentage of that is going to be deni letu, but Kenyans look at this and said, oh my God, we're borrowing again. We're going to get more loans, which will mean we have to start paying again. We have 10.56 trillion, which is our debt. Na tunaenda kuongeza nyingine. And then you look at how the government is planning to borrow. We were talking about these figures, Yvonne, about 760 billion over the 2024-2025 financial year, which is an increase from the around 597 to 600 billion that it had planned to borrow before the rejection of the Finance Bill 2024. So what will this do? It'll set the fiscal deficit as a share of the GDP will increase. They are saying bit from 3.3 to around 4.2%. So when Kenyans wanaona Rais ameenda huko, they're thinking, okay, we're going to borrow more money. How are we going to pay this back? Because we're already struggling to pay. And what will this mean? people look at it in terms of what will it mean for me individually as a person who lives in this country, who's already struggling with the taxes and whatever has been happening with the finance bill and everything that came to a head in June when we had all the protests. But then now, if the money was working for me, if I was seeing roads and I was seeing better services in hospitals and
value
in schools
for money, right.
and value for money, I really wouldn't feel so bad about having to pay more to repay these loans. But then now, I was listening to Sam Gituku today talking about how much we're spending on travel and how much it has gone up by about 20-something percent.
Travel, 34%.
34%. And despite promises that, we're going to try and punguza gharama yetu. And of course, one of the first things that we are told itapunguzwa nizo safari, of course, trainings, yunini, vitu hivi na vile. It beats the purpose. It literally... we do not understand. If Kenya wa kawaida would not understand why we're going to beg for more money while we are struggling to pay what we have, and you're not really doing anything to try and kupunguza gharama yetu and live within our means.
You know, the thing of value for money would be if you're getting all of this expensive debt and it is going to specific projects like Sam is saying, but those projects are not only paying for themselves, they are profitable and they're able to pay back the loan. SGR is not yet there. Since the Chinese company started running it in 2017 and then started to relinquish some of the roles back to the Kenya Railway Corporation starting around 2022, then you start to look at the intended value for money. Shall we also remember that this deal for this loan has never been made public, despite court orders to do so. And as I recall with, the Transport Ministry saying that this would be a breach of it, yet this money was taken in our name and we are the ones who are paying back this money. So then this is the idea of this debt for a big project like this that has so many questions, including its initial value and how that was bloated over time, how it is still not making money, not yet profitable, and how we still don't actually know the details of the loan specifically. What were the terms? What sort of collateral was given despite court orders? Now we hear, we cannot honor that court order because it would be a breach of contractual obligations. So it's just, this is not, it's not pretty.
No, it's not. And remember, it's a one-sided conversation. You have to have it as ourselves. China, just like a good lender, has taken care of its own interests. It's not going to lose any money because you, in any way, the money is being lost on our end, but the repayment has to be on schedule. And in the last 1 year, we've actually seen how much pressure the government has been under because of foreign debt. Because what it obviously does, because it's really an automatic schedule, you have to put it right on top of your budget that you are repaying this debt. And what it does is to pile pressure on other things, which then led to the birth of funny finance bill and, ways to try and raise the money to meet the difference. But yes, even there are many, many questions on how we use our borrowed money. But there's a reason Beijing is a popular borrower's destination for especially African borrowers. They gather there because Beijing doesn't ask a lot of questions. Unlike the IMF, World Bank, which tends to impose a lot of conditionalities on aid, there'll be fewer questions asked in China. You can get what you want, and how you utilize it is absolutely none of their business. That is why, if you look at the SGR, it ends at some funny place in the middle of nowhere in Narok. And, it ends very efficiently. It's Chinese constructed. Yeah. And they constructed it so well to the dead end.
So where does it...
It's called Dukamoja, just past Dukamoja, a place called Olasiti in Narok. It ends in a thicket and ends nicely, complete with a bridge, and it ends where it ends.
It's tidy.
and it's very, very tidy. And it's actually a mockery. It's a statement of what is really wrong in these relationships. I'm sure, and they don't do it, they're very polite people. They know how to play their diplomacy. Maybe they quietly laugh at this and say, you know, they borrowed to construct that, and look where it ended. And these are some of the conversations we need to have as a country. Do we think through those projects as we borrow to finance them? Now, we have, talking of East and West, there was a French firm that had won the... I didn't won anything because... what was the process? I don't know what the
Rironi-Mao Summit.
Yeah, the Rironi-Mao Summit was supposed to have been done by a French firm, and that was offered under the administration of former President Uhuru Kenyatta and his deputy William Ruto at the time. And that has changed now. So out go the French, and now there's talk of China taking that up. We're not sure that has happened yet. I have not seen, at least, I know it's talk that China will take that over. But let's not assume that China is a careless lender. No, it's not. China has succeeded because of very, very smart fiscal policies. They are very good with their money. They are very good with how to generate that and how to lend it responsibly. They don't throw money around, which explains why you remember former President Uhuru Kenyatta and former Prime Minister Raila Odinga could not get, was it 3.6 billion. So Rironi, I wouldn't celebrate first, not for a situation where we still owe so much. We're asking for so much more. And look, China has a lot. It has 53 to 54 priorities around the country. So in the list, Rironi and Angola, some very lucrative and more urgent oil project, for example. You know, we still have to be competitive, but there's a lot of reviewing we really need to do. And just a final point on the SGR, you had mentioned about how costly it is. Whose fault is that? It's not China's. No. It is Kenya's. Now the infrastructure is there. What is the thinking? What is our thinking? I mean, we can't be borrowing money and also borrowing ideas. I think there's something wrong with that arrangement. That, okay, now we've finished the SGR, how do we use it?
Now tell us.
Yeah, tell us how to use it.
Yes.
There's something tragic about that.
Yeah, and you know, you were talking about the French deal. By the way, that tender was awarded during the administration of President Uhuru Kenyatta. It was cancelled this year. And we're going to compensate those firms because you know how those contracts are entered into. There's some type of tenure that is embedded into those contracts. Jamila, kwa Kiswahili tunasema umebwa kura. Literally, kutoka kwa mdomo. Iko kitu kama hiyo.
Umenyakua.
Umenyakua. Kuna kubwa kura tafadhali.
What is that?
It's literally grabbing from the mouth, if you were to look at it that way.
And there is a reason for that. And we need to remember it's not accidental.
Yeah.
When Uhuru Kenyatta and William Ruto came to office in 2013, President Mwai Kibaki had left what was in many ways a very sensible,
manageable
SGR deal that was supposed to deliver a good railway line, SGR from Mombasa to Nairobi and I think onwards to Malaba at a cost that was not what the Uhuru Ruto administration later did with. And we've seen this culture of, you know, administrations changing hands. And the first thing they do is to cancel that.
Yeah.
And there is a reason for that. And that reason is less than about public good. So when Rironi, the French firm, was removed...
Cancelled just this year.
Yeah, it's the same reasons.
Yeah.
And by the way, there was supposed to have been a new airport at some point called the Greenfield Airport. Again, launched by former President Mwai Kibaki. It was quickly.
But the scandal around Greenfield. Oh, yeah, that's quite...
A scandal without a project.
Isn't that how it goes? Yeah. A lot of the time. Yeah. Yes, Sam.
And you see, the interesting bit is that if this succeeds, then Kenya will have accumulated more public debt. I'm just wondering, what is the role of Parliament in all this, because in a county setup, before they can embark on whatever they want to do for the next 5 years, they have something called County Integrated Development Program that stipulates this is where the county wants to go, these are the priorities for the next 5 years, and then as they develop their budgets, then there's something that they need to consider in prioritizing the resources that they receive. Well, Kenya has Vision 2030, and it's quite elaborate on where the country needs to go infrastructure-wise. But at the same time, knowing what we know now, that we already passed what had been the previous debt ceiling, we're also talking about a debt anchor of 55% of the GDP, well, with a window of up to 2028 when it should be taking effect. Shouldn't Parliament have a word on some of these things, so that even if the executive is having consultations or conversations with foreign governments, there should at least be something that Parliament either has considered or will consider at a particular time? Because if we do not, yet Parliament will be required to pass a budget, to pass finance bill that is going to lead to generation of revenue that is supposed to be used to service public debt and also to repay it, then where will the people have been? Because as you're saying about already what is on the ground, the SGR that is on the ground that is not even breaking even, has not been able since inception, then where do you leave the people? They may feel powerless, because at the end of the day, if you bring a project to the country, it should be serving the interests of the people without endangering their financial stability and the future of the economy. Because the reason why there's so much struggle today, to an extent that even households have to struggle on how to foot the bills for education, for health and everything else, including transport, it is because the resources are quite scarce. The government is not able to be offering certain services that it's supposed to be offering, often called public goods. So this cannot continue without the people having a word, especially through Parliament. I would be keen to hear if Parliament has already been briefed on this, because when I look at the budget statement of the former Cabinet Secretary, that is Professor Njuguna Ndung'u, there were 5 mentions of the word railway, and part of it was to ensure that he was saying that he was allocating some 25.2 billion shillings for railway-related infrastructure. And part of that, there was a project about the Nairobi Railway City, but you had to look at how much had been allocated. It was only 239 million shillings for the Nairobi Railway City. So obviously the SGR that you're talking about here is not part of what the budget statement. And it doesn't have to be that, because obviously the budget statement talks about what the priorities for that particular year are. But also in that statement, the Cabinet Secretary often talks about the vision of the government in the coming years, which you don't see talking about those particular projects that we've been told about.
And that railway city, I believe, is being funded by the United Kingdom.
Exactly.
So, my goodness, we shall see what happens. Yani, our infrastructure is UK, China, France, and everyone. Does this not feel like the scramble for Africa once again?
No, it's not. It's the other way around. Who is scrambling? It's a scramble for debt, and it's for...
Well, and then after that, who... They own us, right? If they can't pay.
Well, this time, willingly.
Yeah.
We have offered ourselves.
Yeah.
And in fact, the questions we're raising here apply in many African nations because the use tends to be the same. And that's the reason why they all gather in very dutifully in Beijing when this time comes, because they all have similar needs. And it should be really a pity that 60 years down the line, you know, we used to say our situation is because of colonizers. They were here for 300 years or something like that. But I think what is happening today could actually be qualitatively worse than what happened in colonial times. We owed nobody during the colonial times, except heart attacks, because they were just being introduced. And now we owe so much. And some points out correctly that, you know, even if we get these things that we're talking about now, whether it's Rironi or I wonder what else, it just means you owe more. And the pressure we've had the last 1 year, I mean, this country has nearly had a tragic crisis, and we've lost 60 people during the Gen Z protests because of questions around our revenue, our management of money. Now, we were fighting over how much was it that the finance bill was supposed to raise?
344 billion.
344, and we are borrowing, I think, more than that if we are talking of constructing both the JKI airport and now Rironi. We're talking of more and more, and that means a lot of pressure on the taxpayer, and another decade of difficulty, because let's not forget President Mwai Kibaki left a debt of only 1.8 trillion. And two gentlemen came along in similar shirts, similar ties, and we are 10.8 plus, right? And counting.
You know, what you said just reminds me this as we go to a break. You remember George Orwell's Animal Farm? The pigs became meat oppressors. Let's take a break. We'll be right back. We want to talk about education because there's quite a bit of industrial action in the country in just about quite a few sectors, actually. But we're focusing on the education sector because all the way from secondary